My name is Rachel Morgan, and at 39 I buried my husband and 2 children alone. The morning I called my parents, my voice breaking as I told them David, Ella, and Caleb were gone. I thought they would rush to my side. Instead, I heard laughter, the clink of glasses, and my father's calm reply, "Today is Jessica's birthday. We're in Las Vegas. We can't come." In that moment, I understood I was no longer a daughter. I was disposable. But what my family never imagined was that David had spent years preparing for this day, leaving behind a $5.2 million plan that would turn my grief into something they could never touch. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. It was just an ordinary Tuesday in Henderson, Nevada. The sun streamed in through the kitchen blinds, casting long golden stripes across the counter where David stood, spatula in hand. He was making dinosaur-shaped pancakes for Caleb, our 6-year-old, who sat at the table swinging his legs, giggling every time David roared dramatically before flipping one. Stegosaurus or T-Rex? Buddy. David teased, holding the spatula like a sword. T-Rex. Big teeth. Caleb shouted, his face sticky with syrup from the first pancake. From the living room, I could hear Ella's violin. She was 9, determined, and still hitting the occasional sour note as she worked her way through Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, her little brow furrowed in concentration, tongue poking out between her teeth, and every imperfect note filled the house with a kind of hope only children can bring. I stood by the coffee maker, inhaling the scent of fresh brew mixing with maple syrup, feeling that fleeting contentment of a family morning. David caught my eye, smiled that crooked smile of his, and for a moment, I believed life could stretch on like this forever. As I gathered my bag for work, David leaned close, his breath warm with coffee, pressing a quick kiss to my lips. "See you tonight for Taco Tuesday," he whispered, a tradition that never failed to make the kids cheer. I smiled back. "Don't forget to grab the avocados." He winked, flipping another pancake, and I walked out the door. The sound of Caleb's laughter and Ella's violin followed me into the morning air. I had no idea it was the last time I would ever hear them. At 8:17 a.m., a semi-truck barreled through the intersection of Warm Springs and Green Valley Parkway. The driver had been on the road 16 hours straight, his blood alcohol level 3 times the legal limit. He ran the red light. The impact was instant and catastrophic. I was in a conference room at the firm when my phone rang. Seeing state police on the screen, my stomach twisted before I even answered. "Mrs. Morgan," a man's voice said, calm but heavy. "Son, this is Officer Daniels with the Nevada State Police. There's been an accident." The room spun around me. My assistant's voice became a distant hum. "I don't remember leaving. Don't remember how my car made it across town. I only remember the blur of traffic lights, the sound of my own ragged breathing, and the desperate mantra in my head. Please, God, let them be okay." The hospital corridors were endless fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, cold and merciless. A nurse led me to a room I never wanted to see. 3 white sheets lay waiting. "Are you ready?" she asked gently. I shook my head, but the sheets lifted anyway. First, David. His face still lips pale, the warmth gone. My chest caved in on itself. Then Ella. My sweet girl who had just learned to braid her own hair, her small hands folded against her chest. Finally, Caleb. His little body swallowed by the sheet, his dinosaur band-aids still clinging to scraped knees. I pressed my hands to my mouth to keep from screaming, but the sound tore out anyway, a raw animal sound I didn't know I could make. "There was nothing they could have done," Officer Daniels said softly from the doorway. "It was instant. They didn't suffer, as if that was supposed to comfort me." My legs gave out. The sterile floor met me hard, but I didn't feel it. My family was gone. I stumbled outside, clutching my phone with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I needed someone, anyone, to anchor me. Through the blur of tears, I dialed my parents. Mom answered on the third ring, laughter echoing in the background. "Mom," I choked out. "They're gone. David, Ella, Caleb, they're all gone." There was silence for a beat. Then my father's voice replaced hers. "What do you mean, gone?" I tried to explain, stumbling over the words. "Drunk driver accident, hospital morgue, funeral arrangements." My throat burned with each syllable. When I finished, there was a pause. His voice came back steady, almost rehearsed. "Today is Jessica's birthday. We're in Las Vegas. We can't come." For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. My breath caught. "Dad, I just told you they're dead. I can't do this alone." But the line had already gone quiet, the weight of his words sinking into me like stone. I stood in that hospital parking lot, the Nevada sun blazing down on asphalt, the smell of exhaust thick in the air phone pressed against my ear long after the call ended. My children were lying on cold metal tables inside, and my parents couldn't be bothered to leave a party in Las Vegas. That was the moment something inside me cracked wide open. The last thread tying me to the illusion of family snapped, and the silence that followed was louder than anything I had ever heard. The day of the funeral was blindingly bright. The Nevada sun beat down on the white stone walls of Grace Memorial Church, almost mocking the heaviness inside me. I remember standing at the steps, black dress clinging to my skin, clutching a framed photograph of the four of us. My hands shook so badly I thought I might drop it, but I held on, as if that glass frame was the last barrier keeping me from falling apart completely. Inside, the air was cool and dim, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the old organ. Every pew creaked with the weight of strangers. David's co-workers from the software firm, neighbors who'd left casseroles on my porch. People from the community I hardly knew. Their faces were kind but unfamiliar, their sympathy a fragile blanket over a grief too sharp to dull. 3 caskets stood at the front. My eyes couldn't take them in all at once, so they moved one by one as if punishing me. David's was the largest simple oak, exactly the way he had once said he wanted. Nothing ornate, nothing showy. He had joked that one day, hopefully far away, he'd want to go out the way he lived. Sturdy, no frills. The reality of it now made my knees buckle. Ella's casket was smaller, lined with silver notes, etched delicately across the lid. The funeral director's staff had added them after hearing how she lived with her violin tucked under her chin, always humming something new. I could almost hear her practicing the sweet scratch of bow on strings. And then Caleb's. The smallest of all, painted with bright green dinosaurs by the funeral director's daughter. She had heard how obsessed he was with them and spent hours painting each tiny creature. A T-Rex stood proud on one corner, a brontosaurus grazing on another. It was beautiful and unbearable. I stood between them, my body stiff, my heart clawing against my ribs. The photograph pressed into my chest, felt heavier with every passing minute. From the first row, I saw Dorothy, David's mother. Frail and hunched, her face etched with lines of grief. She had flown from Seattle despite 2 hip replacements, leaning on a cane, refusing to miss the chance to say goodbye to her son and grandchildren. Her tears fell openly, her shoulders trembling. She reached for my hand when I walked past her, her grip weak but desperate. And across from her, where my family should have been, there was nothing. Entire rows of pews were empty, their wooden backs gleaming under the stained glass light. The sight hollowed me out further than I thought possible. I whispered to myself, to no one really. They chose Las Vegas over me. The minister's voice rose solemn and steady. He spoke of life cut short of faith and eternal rest. His words filled the vaulted ceiling, but none of it reached me. My eyes drifted to the caskets again and again, as though my mind kept demanding proof that this was real. When it was time to speak, David's colleagues came forward. Stories of his generosity, his sense of humor, his brilliance at work. They laughed through their tears. Neighbors told me how Ella's music drifted through open windows, how Caleb's laughter carried across backyards. Their kindness should have comforted me, but instead it underscored the absence of my own blood. My father's words from the day before rang in my ears relentless. "We're in Las Vegas. We can't come." I clenched the photograph tighter, my palms slick with sweat. I could picture it so clearly, the neon lights, the sound of slot machines, the clink of glasses. Jessica smiling in a sequined dress while I stood in front of 3 caskets. The service neared its close. The minister asked us all to bow our heads for prayer. I lowered mine, but my phone buzzed in my purse, the vibration like a jolt of electricity against the wood of the pew. I shouldn't have looked. I knew I shouldn't, but I did. On the screen, Jessica's face filled the frame, champagne flute, raised high lips painted crimson, eyes sparkling. The caption read, "Best birthday ever in Vegas. Feeling so blessed. #Vegas vibes, #birthday girl." Laughter glowed behind her in the photo, friends pressed close, neon lights streaking across the background. My vision blurred. I pressed the phone face down on the pew, my pulse hammering in my ears. I couldn't breathe. The minister's words echoed somewhere far away, but all I could hear was the silence from that empty side of the church. All I could see was Jessica's grin on my phone. While I buried my husband and children, my family celebrated under the neon glow of Las Vegas. And in that moment, standing in front of 3 caskets, I understood something I had spent my whole life trying not to admit. I was utterly, completely alone. When the church emptied and the echo of footsteps, faded memories I had buried long ago rose to the surface, sharp and unforgiving. My parents' absence at the funeral was not an isolated cruelty. It was the culmination of a lifetime of choices that had always told me in ways subtle and loud that Jessica mattered more. I had been the good daughter, the one who never complained, who did everything asked of her. At 17, when I held the acceptance letter from Northwestern in my trembling hands, I thought I had finally been seen for who I was. A full scholarship. My way out. My chance. But then came the family meeting in our living room, my father pacing while my mother twisted her pearls. "Your sister needs this, Rachel," my father had said, his tone final. "She has to go to Europe to find herself. You're practical. You'll be fine without Northwestern." I remember staring at Jessica, who sat cross-legged on the couch, grinning, already scrolling through guidebooks of Paris and Rome. I had said nothing. My voice stayed locked inside while I nodded, as if giving away my dream was a natural thing to do. She went off with my college fund, and she did find things in Europe, but not herself. She found bars, men, and debt, returning home a year later with nothing but Instagram photos and credit card bills. Years passed, and the pattern only deepened. When my mother had hip replacement surgery, I took unpaid leave from my job. I cooked every meal, drove her to appointments, managed her medications. Jessica visited once, carrying a bouquet of supermarket flowers, snapping photos with Mom in her recliner. Somehow that one visit earned her the title of devoted daughter at church, while I was the unseen caretaker dismissed with, "Well, Rachel always handles things." I can still smell the antiseptic in that living room, hear the beeping of Mom's medical devices through sleepless nights. I slept on a cot alone while Jessica was out with her 3rd boyfriend that year. On my wedding day, when David took my hand under the lights of the reception hall, I thought maybe, just maybe, this day would be mine. But as the toasts ended and the applause swelled, Jessica clinked her glass and stepped up to the microphone. "I have news," she announced, her face glowing under the chandeliers. "I'm pregnant." The crowd erupted in cheers. Guests swarmed her, and my moment dissolved into confetti at her feet. My dress, my vows, my first dance, all background to Jessica's grand reveal. I stood there, champagne glass in hand, forcing a smile while David's jaw tightened beside me. Later that night, he whispered in our hotel room, "I don't think I've ever seen someone hijack a wedding so completely." I laughed, but it was hollow. It didn't stop there. Years into our marriage, when I was promoted to senior consultant at the firm, I called my parents proud, wanting to hear their voices light up. Instead, Mom sighed. "That's nice, sweetheart, but Jessica's going through a rough divorce. We're all very worried about her." When I hosted Thanksgiving, spending 2 days preparing turkey and pies, Jessica strolled in an hour late with bags of takeout Chinese, dropping them on the counter. Everyone praised her thoughtfulness for bringing food, while the dishes I'd poured my soul into went unnoticed. Each moment stacked on the last bricks in a wall that hemmed me in, trained me to stay small, to make myself invisible. One night, years later, sitting at our dining table after yet another disastrous family dinner, David reached across the table, his eyes steady on mine. "They trained you to disappear, honey." His words cut deeper than any insult my parents had ever thrown. I stared at him, fork frozen midair, my lips trembling. "But they're my family," I whispered, the same weak defense I had always clung to. David shook his head slowly, sorrow etched into his face. "Family shouldn't make you feel invisible." The weight of his words settled into me then, heavy but true. And now, standing in the wreckage of my life after a funeral they hadn't bothered to attend, I knew he had been right all along. The empty pews at Grace Memorial weren't an accident. They were a promise my parents had been keeping my entire life. The house was too quiet. After the funeral, I walked through each room as if I were in a museum of my own life, every corner holding relics that refused to let me breathe. Ella's violin still rested on its stand in the living room, bow balanced delicately across the strings, a frozen note that would never be played again. Caleb's bed upstairs was a tangle of sheets and dinosaur toys, his stuffed triceratops lying on the floor with one ear half chewed. In the kitchen, David's coffee mug sat by the machine, his fingerprints smudged faintly on the handle. I drifted from room to room, voice in my head whispering, "Maybe if I open this door, they'll be there." I knew better, but grief does strange things. It tricks you into believing the impossible just for a second, enough to keep you moving. Nights were the worst. I would lie awake staring at the ceiling until the shadows blurred, and then I'd hear them. Caleb's feet pounding down the stairs, David singing off-key in the shower, Ella's violin stumbling over the same notes again and again. Phantom sounds, my brain refusing to accept silence. Sometimes I would get up and wander the hallways, convinced I might catch them in the act. Each time I found only stillness, the emptiness so thick it pressed on my chest. The bills piled up on the kitchen counter, a cruel reminder that death didn't stop the world from demanding payment. The funeral director's invoice glared at me, $28,000. The smallest casket was somehow the most expensive. "We offer payment plans," he had said kindly, as if burying my children on credit made sense. The mortgage company sent warnings too. David and I had just finished remodeling the kitchen, thinking we'd have decades to enjoy it. Now it felt like a debt I could never repay. My consulting work was part-time, barely covering groceries, let alone the avalanche of expenses. I would sit at the table staring at spreadsheets, trying to make numbers bend to a reality that didn't exist. Every figure ended in red. Through it all, my parents stayed silent. No visits, no calls. Just 2 text messages from my mother. "How are you holding up?" The words felt like a slap. How was I holding up? I was drowning, and they couldn't even be bothered to throw me a rope. Some nights I stood on the back deck, staring at the desert sky stars scattered across the dark like shattered glass. Ella used to point out constellations, David teaching her their names, while Caleb insisted there had to be dinosaur stars somewhere. I would stand there until my legs went numb, the thought circling relentlessly. It would be easier if I just stopped. If I let the night take me and joined them wherever they were. One night the thought pressed harder than usual. I gripped the railing, tears streaming down my face, whispering apologies to my children. I don't know how long I stood there, but the shrill ring of the phone inside snapped me back. My hands shook as I stumbled in, half expecting another sympathy call I couldn't bear. It was Paul Chen. His voice was steady, urgent. "Rachel, I've been trying to reach you. David prepared something important. We need to meet." I sank into a chair, the phone pressed to my ear. Prepared something. My voice was hoarse. What could he possibly have prepared for this? There was a pause, as if he were weighing his words. Let's just say David was meticulous. He wanted to make sure you'd be protected no matter what happened. I closed my eyes, clutching the phone tighter. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt since the accident. Not relief, not comfort, just the faintest spark of hope, small and trembling but alive. I whispered into the phone, almost afraid to believe it. "When can I come in tomorrow morning?" he said firmly. "My office 9 o'clock. Rachel, you need to hear this." When the call ended, the house felt different. Still empty, still unbearably quiet, but no longer suffocating me in the same way. I sat there in the dark, staring at David's coffee mug on the counter, wondering what secrets he had left behind for me to discover. Paul Chen's office was tucked into a quiet corner of a professional building in downtown Henderson. The sun streamed through his blinds, bathing the room in a warm, golden light that felt at odds with the heaviness I carried in my chest. I sank into the leather chair across from his desk, clutching my purse like it was the only thing keeping me upright. Paul, a tall man in his mid-50s with silver hair at his temples, gave me a kind look. He spoke with the calm tone of someone who had done this too many times, but there was something in his eyes that told me this wasn't just another file for him. "Rachel," he began, gently sliding a thick folder across the desk toward me. "David was one of the most prepared clients I've ever had. He left very clear instructions." I frowned, my fingers trembling as I opened the folder. Inside were neatly organized documents, insurance forms, signatures I recognized immediately as David's. Paul tapped one page with his pen. In 2010, when Ella was born, he purchased a life insurance policy for $2 million. In 2013, after Caleb arrived, he added another, again for $2 million. And in 2017, following an incident he referred to in his notes, he secured a third policy for $1.2 million. My eyes blurred as the numbers swam on the page. $5.2 million, I whispered, my voice breaking. We lived paycheck to paycheck some months. How? How could he have done this without me knowing? Paul folded his hands. He was deliberate. Paid monthly premiums, quietly worked side contracts in cybersecurity to cover them. He didn't want you to feel the strain or the guilt of knowing. He said, and I quote, "My wife has sacrificed enough for everyone else. This is for her alone." The weight of his words struck something deep inside me. I thought about the times I had clipped coupons, skipped buying a new coat, or picked up extra consulting hours just to make ends meet. All the while, David had been quietly building a safety net, protecting me in a way I never imagined. Paul reached into his drawer and produced a sealed envelope, its edges worn from years of waiting. He slid it across the desk. "This is a letter he wrote for you. He asked that I give it to you only under these circumstances." My hands shook as I broke the seal. David's handwriting, familiar and steady, stared back at me. "Rachel, if you are reading this, it means I am gone and the unthinkable has happened. I'm so sorry, my love. You gave so much of yourself to a family that never gave back. I saw it all. I want you to know that every dollar here is for you and for whatever future you choose. Don't let them take it. Don't let them twist it. You deserve a life built on more than sacrifice. Build something beautiful from this pain. Always, David." Tears spilled down my cheeks, blurring the ink. I pressed the letter to my chest, wishing I could hear his voice, feel his hand on mine just once more. Paul's voice broke the silence. "There's more." He left a recording. He opened his laptop, turned the screen toward me, and pressed play. My breath caught. There he was. David, sitting in the very office I was in now, wearing his favorite navy tie, the one Ella had picked out for Father's Day. His eyes were steady, his smile faint but full of love. "Rachel." His voice filled the room, strong and alive. "If you're watching this, then my worst fear has happened. I need you to know I planned this for you. For years, I watched you give everything to your parents, to Jessica, to everyone who asked. You disappeared so they could shine. I won't let them take from you again. This money, it's untouchable. They can't touch it. It's for you. Use it to build something to find life again. Build something beautiful from this pain. My sobs were silent but violent, shaking my whole body. It was as if he had reached across time to hold me, to remind me I wasn't abandoned after all. When the video ended, Paul closed the laptop softly. Sobs. He didn't rush me, didn't try to fill the silence. He just let me sit there, gripping the edge of the desk, trying to remember how to breathe. For the first time since that morning at the hospital, the crushing weight on my chest eased, if only a little. Hope flickered faintly in the ashes of everything I had lost. Fragile, but real. I wiped my eyes, voice raw. He really thought of everything, didn't he? Paul nodded, his gaze steady. He loved you more than anything. And now, Rachel, you have the chance to decide what to do with what he left you. I folded the letter carefully, holding it against my heart. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel completely powerless. Somewhere deep inside, a new resolve stirred. David was still protecting me, and maybe, just maybe, I could honor him by finding a way to protect myself too. A week after the funeral, the phone rang while I was sitting at the kitchen table staring at a stack of unpaid bills. My mother's voice came through the line, too cheerful, too practiced. "Rachel, honey," she said, "we've been talking and we think it's time to start helping each other. Family helps family. Jessica and Mark are trying for a baby, you know. IVF is expensive. Maybe you should think about what David would want." I gripped the phone tighter, my nails biting into my palm. My voice came out sharp, trembling with anger. David would never want this conversation. There was silence on the other end, followed by a clipped breath. "Don't be dramatic," Mom said, her tone flattening. "We'll talk soon." I hung up before she could say another word. My hands shook as I set the phone down, the rage buzzing in my ears louder than the hum of the refrigerator. 3 days later, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I looked through the peephole, my stomach dropped. Jessica and Mark stood on the porch in sunglasses, smiling too wide like they were there for a casual visit. I opened the door, halfway blocking the entry with my body. "What do you want?" Jessica's voice was soft, syrupy. "We were in the neighborhood and thought we'd check on you." "We're worried, Rachel. It's not healthy to be here all alone." Mark's eyes darted past me into the house. I noticed the way his gaze lingered on the flat screen David had splurged on last year, the polished piano Ella had begged for, the granite countertops David had installed himself. His eyes gleamed not with concern but with calculation. "We're fine," I said coldly, starting to close the door. Mark put his hand on the frame to stop me. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "This place must be worth, what, 600 grand, maybe more. Big house for just one person. It must feel overwhelming." Jessica stepped closer, laying a hand on my arm as if we were sisters sharing a secret. "We could take it off your hands. Family discount, of course. $350 cash, quick deal, no hassle. It would be a win-win." Her voice dripped with false sweetness, but the words landed like poison. I froze for a moment, staring at them, stunned by their audacity. My mind flashed back to David's video, his promise that they wouldn't touch what he had left for me. I steadied my breath, lifted my chin, and spoke evenly. "Get out of my house." Jessica blinked, her smile cracking into a scowl. "Excuse me." "You heard me," I said, my voice stronger now. "Leave. Right now." Her face twisted, anger flooding her features. "Mom and Dad are right. You've always been selfish, Rachel. We're family. You'll regret treating us this way." Mark slipped his phone from his pocket, raising it briefly as if to check a message, but I caught the click of the camera. His eyes flicked across the room, lingering on the crown molding the hardwood floors. I stepped forward, yanked the door wider. "Out," I said louder this time, the word echoing through the foyer. For a long second, no one moved. Then Jessica jerked her arm away, muttering under her breath. Mark followed her out, his phone still in his hand. I slammed the door and locked it, my heart hammering in my chest. Through the window, I watched them walk back to their car. Jessica's heels clicking angrily against the driveway, Mark raising his phone once more to snap a photo of the exterior before sliding behind the wheel. The engine started tires crunching on gravel, and then they were gone. But the echo of Jessica's words, "You'll regret this," and the flash of Mark's camera left me cold. I stood in the middle of the house surrounded by silence and realized with a shiver that they hadn't come to check on me. They had come to stake a claim, and they weren't finished. The text came on a Friday evening just as the sun slipped behind the mountains and the shadows lengthened across my living room. My mother's name lit up the screen, followed by words that made my stomach twist. Family meeting. Sunday, 2 p.m. Don't make it harder than it needs to be. I stared at the message until the letters blurred my chest tight. They weren't asking. They were summoning me. By Sunday afternoon, I drove to my parents' house in Summerlin every mile, making my hands grip the wheel tighter. When I pulled into the driveway, there were more cars than I expected. Too many. A family reunion disguised as an ambush. Inside the living room was full. Aunt Margaret had flown in from Florida, sitting primly with her hands folded in her lap, eyes sharp. A few cousins I hadn't seen in years lingered against the wall, and in the corner stood a woman I didn't recognize, mid-40s professional attire, clipboard tucked under her arm. My mother introduced her with a proud smile. "This is Dr. Foster, a family counseling specialist. She's here to help." Help! The word was sour in my mouth. I sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, the air heavy. "Boy," my father cleared his throat, his voice carrying the authority he had always wielded like a weapon. "Rachel, we're worried about you. You've been through a terrible tragedy, and it's clear you're not in the right frame of mind to make big decisions." I blinked at him, heat rising in my chest. "What decisions?" He gestured toward Dr. Foster, who stepped forward smoothly. "Grief can cloud judgment," she said in a calm, rehearsed tone. "Sometimes it's best to have safeguards in place. A family trust would allow everyone to support you to ensure your husband's insurance and assets are managed responsibly." I stared at her, then at the faces around the room. Jessica sat across from me, a tissue pressed dramatically to her eyes, dabbing at tears that weren't there. She sniffled and shook her head. "We're only trying to help you, Rachel. Don't push us away." A cousin chimed in, leaning forward from his chair. "Family trusts benefit everyone, even you." "You wouldn't have to carry all this alone." The words pounded in my head, each one chipping away at the thin wall of control I had left. I clenched my fists, nails biting into my palms. "My children are dead," I said, my voice shaking but sharp enough to cut the room in half. "And you're sitting here talking about money." A silence fell thick and suffocating. My father shifted his jaw tight. "You don't understand. This is about stability, about family. You've always been impulsive." "No," I snapped, standing abruptly. My chair scraped back across the hardwood. My pulse roared in my ears. Jessica looked up at me with wide eyes, her tissue crumpled in her hand. "Rachel, please." "Don't." I warned, my voice low, trembling with fury. My mother wrung her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sweetie, we just want what's best. You can't carry this all by yourself." I reached into my purse, pulled out my car keys, and flung them onto the coffee table. The clatter rang out like a gunshot. Every eye in the room followed them. "I've had enough," I said, my voice steady now, every syllable laced with finality. "You don't get to dictate my grief. You don't get to dictate my life. Not anymore." The room erupted in murmurs. My aunt's sharp inhale, a cousin's muttered, selfish, Jessica's soft sobs that sounded more like performance than pain. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I turned, walked to the door, and pulled it open. The desert air hit my face, hot and dry, a rush of freedom in contrast to the stifling room I had just left behind. Behind me, voices rose. My father calling my name, Jessica, begging me to come back, Dr. Foster's calm drone trying to mediate, but I kept walking down the steps across the driveway into my car. When the engine roared to life, I felt my breath steady for the first time in weeks. Their voices faded behind me as I pulled away my tires, crunching over the gravel. I didn't know exactly where I was going, only that I was done letting them stage interventions and ambushes done, letting them twist my grief into their gain. For the first time in my life, I was certain whatever came next, it would be on my terms, not theirs. The envelope was thick, official, and stamped with the seal of the Clark County District Court. My hands trembled as I slid a finger under the flap, the paper tearing too easily. Inside was the summons. My parents and Jessica had filed suit against me, demanding access to David's life insurance policies. I read the words 3 times, hoping they would change, but they only grew heavier with each pass. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed in the black suit I hadn't worn since before the accident, the fabric hanging looser on my body. I met Paul Chen outside the courthouse. His presence was a steadying weight beside me as we walked through the glass doors into the cavernous lobby. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected, intimate in a way that made the air feel close, suffocating. Judge Marcus Reed presided at the bench, his expression unreadable, gavel poised. I sat at the table with Paul, trying to focus on my breathing. Across from us, my father sat stiff in his chair, jaw set like stone. My mother twisted her wedding ring nervously, and Jessica dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, looking fragile and wronged. Their attorney, a slick man in a gray suit, rose first. His voice was smooth, practiced. "Your Honor, we are here today because Ms. Rachel Morgan is understandably in a state of severe emotional distress. She has suffered an unimaginable loss, and while we sympathize deeply, her mental instability raises serious concerns about her ability to responsibly manage over $5 million in assets. We propose the establishment of a family trust overseen collectively to ensure the funds are preserved and used appropriately." The words sliced through me. Mental instability. Family trust. My fingers dug into the edge of the table nails, pressing half moons into the wood. Paul stood slowly, adjusting his glasses. His voice carried a weight that immediately commanded the room. "Your Honor, what my colleagues on the other side fail to mention is that Mr. David Morgan anticipated exactly this kind of betrayal. He knew his wife's family might attempt to exploit her grief. He took extraordinary measures to ensure his wishes were clear and beyond dispute." He clicked a button on the remote he had brought, and the courtroom lights dimmed slightly as a screen lowered. A video began to play. My breath caught in my throat. The footage was stark, unflinching. Grace Memorial Church. The camera panned slowly across the front rows of pews where the names Richard Walker, Linda Walker, and Jessica Walker were printed on neat cards taped to the wood. Each seat was empty. The timestamp in the corner confirmed the date and time of the funeral. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Then David's face filled the screen. He was seated in Paul's office, wearing that same navy tie Ella had chosen, eyes steady, voice unshakable. "If you're watching this," he said, "it means my fears were right. Rachel, if they are here, they've proven exactly who I always knew they were. To the Walkers. Richard, Linda, Jessica. You had your chance to be family when she needed you most. You chose otherwise. Don't give them a penny." The silence afterward was deafening. Jessica's face flushed crimson, her tissue crumpled tightly in her hand. My father leaned forward, jaw clenched, while my mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Paul didn't stop there. He produced a second folder, dropping it lightly on the table before the judge. "In addition, Your Honor, these documents outline $37,000 in loans provided by David Morgan to the Walkers over the past 8 years. Not a single dollar was repaid. It is clear the family has a history of financial dependence on my client's late husband, and it is equally clear that Mr. Morgan wanted no part of that to continue after his death." The opposing attorney tried to recover his words, stumbling. "Your Honor, we can't verify." Judge Reed raised a hand, his voice sharp. "I've seen enough." He glanced at the video screen, then at the papers before him. His expression was firm, decisive. "The will is valid. The policies are clear. The claims made by the Walkers are baseless. This case is dismissed." The gavel struck wood, echoing like thunder through the room. Relief washed over me so swiftly my eyes burned with tears. Across the aisle, Jessica burst into whispered protests, her voice rising as she turned on her parents. My father's face had gone ashen, his hands clenched into fists on the table. My mother looked small, deflated, her eyes darting anywhere but mine. Paul leaned close, his voice low so only I could hear. "It's over, Rachel. You're free of this, at least legally." I nodded, unable to speak. My throat closed around the words I wanted to say. I gathered my bag with shaking hands and rose from my seat. As I walked out of that courtroom, I didn't look back. Behind me, the voices of my family rose in chaos, angry, desperate, unraveling. But I kept moving forward, the doors swinging wide into the bright Nevada sun. For the first time since the accident, I felt the faintest surge of something like power stirring inside me. The headline hit the Las Vegas Review-Journal 2 days after the court hearing. "Family skips funeral for Vegas party." Then Sue's daughter. My stomach lurched as I stared at the bold letters on the front page. Below it, a split-screen image seared itself into my memory. On the left, the footage from Grace Memorial showing empty pews with my family's names taped neatly to them. On the right, Jessica clinking glasses of champagne under the neon glow of Caesar's Palace. By that evening, the story had spread across social media. #Vegas Party Scandal began trending within hours, people sharing the images with captions dripping with outrage. Strangers debated my family's sins in comments sections, their cruelty laid bare for everyone to see. Jessica's company, a mid-size marketing firm, moved quickly. By the next morning, she was escorted out of the building with a cardboard box in her arms. The official statement from the CEO read, "We pride ourselves on integrity and values. Misalignment of these values leaves us no choice but to part ways." I didn't see it firsthand, but someone sent me a photo. A grainy shot of Jessica leaving the office, face hidden behind oversized sunglasses, hair messy. Her husband Mark a step behind her carrying another box. Mark didn't fare any better. His fledgling startup lost its investors within a week. Partners withdrew funding citing concerns about long-term reputation management. His office lease was terminated shortly after. The man who once bragged about becoming the next tech mogul now had nothing but debt and burned bridges. My father, who had built his identity around being a pillar of the church community, faced his own reckoning. The pastor called an emergency board meeting. Within days, Richard Walker was asked to resign his seat on the church's governing council after 2 decades. The same congregation he had once lectured about family values now looked at him with pity and contempt. Linda, my mother, received her punishment in more subtle but equally cutting ways. The Women's Guild, her social lifeline, rescinded her invitation to the annual gala. The letter was curt. "Given recent revelations, we believe your attendance would be inappropriate." She stopped posting photos of luncheons and charity events. Neighbors stopped waving when she stepped out for the mail. The blow that seemed to cut deepest came not from the papers, but from a former friend of Jessica's, someone she had partied with in Las Vegas. The woman posted publicly on Facebook I was at that Vegas party. Jessica was laughing, dancing, drinking, not mourning her niece and nephew. Disgusting. The post went viral, overnight screenshots flooding Twitter and Instagram. I read the comments but didn't respond. Some called for boycotts, others for accountability. A few reached out privately asking me to confirm details or give interviews. Reporters called and emailed their voices eager, offering me a platform to tell my side. I deleted every message. I knew people expected me to speak, to deliver some righteous statement or condemn my family in public. But I couldn't. The thought of putting words to everything felt like another wound. Instead, I chose silence. In the quiet of my house, I let the storm rage outside. I watched as the people who had dismissed me, ignored me, abandoned me when I needed them most, were finally held accountable. Not by me, but by the world watching. At night, I sat on the back porch under the desert sky, phone buzzing on the table beside me with notifications I refused to open. I sipped cold coffee and listened to the cicadas hum. My voice stayed locked in my chest. I whispered only to myself, words carried off by the wind. I choose silence. Sometimes silence is louder than anything you could ever say. After the noise of the scandal faded, I sat at my kitchen table with David's letter in one hand and the financial statements in the other. For weeks, I had been paralyzed, afraid to touch the money he had left me, as if spending even $1 might erase him further. But then I remembered his words, "Build something beautiful from this pain." So I began. Paul Chen connected me with an accountant, a woman named Susan Myers, who had lost her brother to a drunk driver in Phoenix a decade earlier. She understood my hesitation, my grief, and she spoke to me not like a client but like someone who had stood in the same storm. Together we went through every detail: insurance, disbursements, trust structures, tax implications. It was overwhelming. But for the first time since the accident, I felt like I was steering something instead of being swept under. I decided to put $3 million into the creation of a nonprofit, the Morgan Family Foundation. The remaining $2.2 million stayed in conservative investments for stability, my safety net. Forming the foundation was grueling in its own way. Paperwork stacked high forms for state and federal registration interviews with potential staff. I made one decision early: anyone who worked with me had to carry the same scars, the same understanding of loss. I wanted people who knew what it meant to answer the phone at 3 a.m. and have their world ripped apart. That's how I found Maria Lopez, a quiet woman in her 40s who had lost her teenage son to a drunk driver 5 years before. She became my program director. Then there was Kyle Thompson, whose younger sister was killed walking home from school. He took charge of outreach. We didn't need to explain ourselves to one another. One look, one pause in a sentence, and we understood. From the beginning, I knew I wanted 2 programs to carry my children's names. Ella's music room would provide instruments and lessons to children who had lost parents, a way to let them find comfort in sound the way Ella had. I pictured a room filled with violins, pianos, guitars, small hands plucking strings, bowing notes, learning that beauty could still exist after tragedy. Caleb's Dino Library would deliver books and toys to children who had lost siblings. Dinosaurs had been his obsession, his joy. I wanted other kids to feel that spark, to lose themselves in stories instead of grief. The first request for help came within weeks. A little girl in Reno, 8 years old, had lost both parents to a drunk driver. Her grandmother was struggling to cover funeral costs. When the application crossed my desk, I froze, my throat closing as I read the details. The girl's name was Amy. She was the same age Ella had been. We approved $15,000 immediately. I traveled to Reno with Maria to deliver the check personally. When we arrived at the small rented house, the grandmother opened the door, her eyes red and swollen, her hands trembling as she clutched mine. Amy peeked out from behind her, clutching a stuffed rabbit. Her hair tangled her face, pale. The grandmother's voice cracked as she tried to speak. "You don't know what this means for us. Rachel, you saved us." The words struck me so hard my knees weakened. I wanted to tell her I hadn't saved anyone, that I was just trying to hold myself together, that I was barely breathing most days. But then Amy came closer, eyes wide, and whispered, "Thank you." I bent down, brushing her hair from her face, and managed to smile. "This is for you," I said softly. "For you and your grandma. You're not alone." Back in the car, I held the folder with Amy's application against my chest. Tears spilling freely for the first time in months. Not the hot tears of rage or the empty tears of despair, but something new, something lighter. That night I stood in my living room staring at the photos of Ella and Caleb on the mantel. I traced their faces with my finger, their smiles frozen in time, and I broke. My sobs filled the empty house, body shaking as I pressed the pictures to my chest. But this time it wasn't just grief. It was something else tangled inside it. Something alive. For the first time since the accident, I felt like maybe what I was doing mattered. That David's plan, his relentless preparation, wasn't just about survival. It was about creating life in the ruins. I whispered into the quiet room, "I hope I'm making you proud." And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like an answer. By 2022, the Morgan Family Foundation had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. What started as a small office with 3 of us in Henderson had spread into 8 states. We had helped more than 1,500 families, covering funeral costs, funding therapy, giving scholarships, keeping the lights on for parents who had lost everything in a single night to a drunk driver. The recognition came slowly at first. Articles in local papers, then interviews I reluctantly agreed to when the foundation needed visibility to expand. That year, the Las Vegas Convention Center held the state's annual philanthropy gala. When my name was called as Philanthropist of the Year, the room rose to its feet. The applause was deafening, but all I could think about was Ella's bow scraping across strings, Caleb's laughter echoing down the hall, David's voice teasing me about my tendency to downplay my accomplishments. I stood at the podium, accepted the award, smiled for photographs, but my heart belonged somewhere else. Back at the graves in Henderson, where I whispered every victory into the desert wind so they would hear it too. While the foundation thrived, the Walkers crumbled. My father lost the house he once boasted was the cornerstone of our family. Richard and Linda sold it quietly, the for sale sign disappearing almost as quickly as it had gone up. They moved into a cramped apartment off Charleston Boulevard. Neighbors who once envied them no longer made eye contact at the grocery store. My father's voice, once booming with authority, was reduced to short nods in the church parking lot. My mother stopped wearing her pearls, trading them for silence. Jessica's downfall was harsher. Mark walked out 6 months after the scandal fully destroyed his business prospects. The divorce left her drained with custody of their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia. She worked nights as a receptionist at a medical clinic and mornings at a daycare. She was 20 pounds thinner, her once polished nails chipped and bare. For the first time in her life, she looked ordinary. I told myself I wouldn't interfere, that she had made her bed. But when I saw Sophia's photograph online, her curls framing her little face, her smile so uncannily like Ella's, I felt my chest cave in. Innocence had no place in the fallout of adult cruelty. I called Paul Chen. "I want to set up an education fund," I said, voice low. 50. No, $60,000. It has to stay anonymous. She can't access it. It's only for Sophia. Only when she turns 18. Paul didn't question me. He drew up the paperwork and I signed it with a trembling hand. The fund was sealed, her name etched into documents she wouldn't see for 16 more years. It was the only way I could reconcile the part of me that still ached for blood ties, the part that refused to punish a child for her mother's sins. A few weeks later, a letter arrived at my office. The envelope was thin, the handwriting messy, the ink smudged in places as if tears had soaked through. "Rachel," it began, "I know I have no right to write this. I was cruel. I was selfish. I see it now, every choice I made. Sophia looks like Ella sometimes, and it breaks me that she will never know her cousins. I am sorry. I am so desperately sorry. If I could take it back, I would. I don't want money. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know that I finally understand what we took from you." The words blurred as I read them again and again. For the first time, Jessica's voice on the page sounded human, stripped of performance. I sat for a long time with that letter in my lap. The office empty except for the hum of the air conditioner. Finally, I pulled out stationery with the foundation's letterhead and began to write. "Jessica, I received your letter. Thank you for your honesty. I forgive you, but forgiveness is not reconciliation. This is the last letter between us. Do not reach out again." I paused, my pen hovering before I finished. Sophia is innocent in all this. Love her better than you loved me, better than you loved Ella and Caleb. Be present for her. That is the only way forward. I signed my name, folded the paper, and sealed it in an envelope. As I slid it across Paul's desk for mailing, I felt no relief, no triumph. Just finality. When I got home that night, I stood in front of the photographs on my mantel again, their smiles frozen in time. I forgave her, I whispered into the quiet, but I didn't let her back in. The silence of the house held me gently, no longer suffocating, but firm like hands, pressing me forward. It was enough. By the spring of 2025, the desert mornings had softened. I walked the familiar path through Henderson Memorial Cemetery, a bouquet of fresh lilies in my hands, the grass damp with dew beneath my shoes. The air was quiet still, the kind of silence that no longer pressed against my chest, but settled gently around me. I stopped at the 3 headstones in a neat row. David's in the center, Ella's on the left, Caleb's on the right. Their names were carved deep into the granite, the letters catching the morning light. I knelt and placed the flowers across all 3, brushing my fingers over each inscription. "It's been 6 years," I whispered. 6 years since everything fell apart, and somehow we're still building. I told them about what had happened, as I always did. About the Morgan Family Foundation, which had grown far beyond what I thought possible. More than 2,000 families helped. 12 states now had programs under our banner. Music rooms filled with instruments, libraries stocked with books and stuffed with dinosaurs. Therapy sessions paid for funerals covered children given scholarships their parents had once dreamed of. I pulled out a stack of folded letters from my purse. Some of the hundreds I'd kept from families we'd helped. A mother in Arizona thanking us for covering her son's burial. A teenager in Oregon who wrote about learning guitar through Ella's music room. A grandmother in Utah who said Caleb's dino library was the only thing that made her other grandsons smile again. I read their words aloud, letting them drift across the stones. They all say the same thing, that they found hope when they thought there was none, that we gave them back a little piece of their lives. That's because of you. All of you. The breeze stirred, carrying the faint scent of desert sage. I closed my eyes and remembered David's voice in Paul Chen's office, the recording I had played so many times I could recite it from memory. Build something beautiful from this pain. I looked up at his headstone, my throat tightening. I did it, David. We did it. It's not just money anymore. It's a legacy. Your legacy. Their legacy. And mine. The Walkers were ghosts now, shadows on the periphery of a life I no longer shared with them. My father and mother remained in their small apartment across town, avoiding eye contact with anyone who remembered. Jessica worked double shifts to raise Sophia, who was nearly 5, now her curls bouncing like Ella's had once. The scholarship fund in her name grew quietly untouched, waiting for a future she didn't yet know existed. I had no intention of telling Jessica where it came from. Grace sometimes needed distance to survive. As I stood smoothing the grass with my hand, I felt no bitterness, no lingering fire of revenge. Karma had done its work, stripping away the facades they'd built. My choice had been to move forward, to grow something from ashes. Family isn't blood, I said softly into the morning air. Family is who shows up. I stayed there until the sun climbed higher, warming my skin, and a peace I hadn't known in years settled into me. The grief was still there, always would be, but it had changed shape. It no longer consumed me. It simply lived beside me, woven into the work, into the foundation, into every life touched by their names. When I turned to leave, I glanced back one last time, smiling through the tears that blurred my vision. I walked out of the cemetery lighter than I had walked in, carrying not just loss, but purpose. And if you've ever been abandoned, betrayed, or made to feel invisible by the very people who should have loved you most, remember this. You are worthy of love, of peace, of being chosen. You don't have to carry the weight of toxic ties. You can build a life with the people who truly show up for you. If this story has touched you, share your thoughts with me. Tell me what boundaries you've set, what peace you've chosen. Your voice matters here, and your story might be the light someone else is waiting for. Because at the end of it all, we all deserve to be valued, respected, and loved, always.